This week's podcast will be published on Easter Sunday in 2024. And consequently, I can't think of a more appropriate guest than Bishop Graham James, who I had the pleasure of interviewing for this week. He's a fascinating character, having been a lifelong member of the church as a priest and then a bishop. He was Bishop of Norwich for a record-breaking 20 years, from 1999 to 2019. And he's just a fabulous human being. He has a tremendous story about all sorts of things that he's done across his life, the work he's done basically to do good in the diocese that he's had, and he's had a wide variety of challenging environments that he's worked in. And even in retirement, he's now doing very active things that he'll talk about in the podcast that, again, are for the kind of general good of humanity. And as such, it's a lovely chance to to have a perspective from a man who has a very strong faith, obviously, and a lot of great views on a wider range of world issues as well. I first met Graham when I actually flew him in a Jaguar when I was a squadron commander at RAF Coltishall. He had been Bishop of Norwich for a couple of years by that point. And I flew him in 2001, and we had a great trip, and were met on return by the BBC Local News, who interviewed him about him going flying and those sorts of things. And I've certainly never forgotten it. It was one of those passenger rides that was particularly special. And I think the interview was fascinating, and I really hope you enjoy it as well. And off we go. Well, Graham, thank you so much indeed for joining me on the podcast today. It's fabulous that I've got you. This episode is going to go out on Easter Sunday as well. So having a Bishop of Norwich or former Bishop of Norwich is just a wonderful opportunity for me. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, it's very good to be on and to see you again, Bob, after such a long time in a rather different setting.
Yeah, very different setting. I was looking I looked it up just before we came on air, but we actually flew together in a Jaguar in February of 2001, which is a long time ago, and B, was a great experience. I remember it vividly when I was a squadron commander at Coltishall, and I think you were relatively newly in the.
Well, I was in my second year, but I can remember when we came back, it was rather foggy, and there was a bit of doubt whether we would be able to land, but fortunately we did, because the BBC Look East cameras were there to capture the bedraggled bishop getting out of the Jaguar, as I recall.
Yeah, divine intervention probably played a part there, clearing the fog to make sure we got back in. That's got to be helpful, hasn't it? So, I just to kick this off, I mean, you've had an amazing and a very long career in the church, and this, as I mentioned a second ago, this podcast is going to come out on Easter Sunday, so it's great to be doing an interview with you. But I'd love a starter for 10, really, for you just to do a bit of a career summary of your journey.
Yeah, well, I was the first in my family to go to university. That's the first thing I think it's worth saying, and that was to Lancaster University in 1969, the end of the 60s, when there were still student strikes, or there were at Lancaster, and it was a very new place. And as a sign that I was looking back on this, I didn't really know what I wanted to do at the age of 18. I was hardly unusual in that. I applied to Lancaster to read economics. I then wrote to them to change and said I'd really rather read English. And when I got there at the end of the first year, I changed to reading history. So that shows you a sort of uncertainty. And then I went on to Oxford to study theology after that. I mean, that's another story about, we'll come on to motivation, I think, about why I decided to get ordained. And then at the age of 24, having been in full-time education for so much of my life, I finally got ordained and went off to be the curate of a new parish on a large council estate on the outskirts of Peterborough, a place called Dogsthorpe. I mean, it wasn't fashionable, but it was a place with a wonderful community life and lively congregation. I soon became the chair of the church cricket club, which we established, playing in the Peterborough League. And I had my first, my first year, one of the members of the congregation who volunteered to be the treasurer, who I thought was brilliant, embezzled all the money and ran away from home. And
Oh, no.
so it was it was a sharp learning curve about people and so on. But it was great in all sorts of other ways. And then after 3.5 years there, I went to Welwyn Garden City to an even newer church to be the priest in charge. And this was one that hadn't done well. It had been built for 14 years, and I was the 7th priest there. So you can see that, hardly anybody stayed any length of time. But the congregation grew, and I did stay for quite a while. It was an estate without many facilities, so I used to go into the pub. That was the first means of actually meeting people. We set up a residents' association and to create a community centre, which is still there. And we actually had some candidates for ordination in the congregation. I thought 1 or 2 weren't dealt with very well, partly because of their background. They were faithful but not articulate, put it that way. So they were quite hard for the selection system to manage. And then I saw an advert for a job in Church House in Westminster, dealing with the selection procedures of the Church of England. And I applied for it. You didn't really apply for posts in those days if you were a priest. You waited to be approached for things. And I went off to this interview, not really expecting to be appointed, but I was. And at the age of 32, I found myself in charge of all the selection procedures for ordination in the Church of England. That was about 1,000 candidates a year. Usually in groups of 16 with 6 selectors who met residentially for their interviews and group work and so on. So you saw people at meals and at worship. So it's quite a good system. It's been pared down a bit since then, but it was a great experience, that. And after 5 years there, I got a call and I was asked to go across to meet the Archbishop of Canterbury, who needed a new chaplain. And the chaplain is a sort of principal private secretary, like they are to a cabinet minister. You advise, you draft speeches. You're the main point of access to the Archbishop, as well as the person who, of course, is with him as a companion and support. And then 6 years later, and after a change of Archbishop, I was asked to return to my native Cornwall, where I hadn't lived since I was 11, to be the suffragan Bishop of St. Germans down here, the sort of assistant bishop. And that meant that I made the Guinness Book of Records. At the age of 42, I was the youngest bishop in the Church of England. When I left Norwich, I had the record of being the longest serving bishop in the Church of England. So, it didn't last long being the youngest bishop, I'm afraid. And in 1999, I was appointed Bishop of Norwich and served there for nearly 20 years until I returned back to Cornwall. You really need to leave where you've been, if you've been there a long time, to give your successor a chance. And so 400 miles away, I'm not likely to interfere too much. But Norwich was interesting. I mean, those who know Norfolk will know it's a big county, and we also had a big lodge of Suffolk in it as well, around Lowestoft. You could drive for 2 hours in the diocese without leaving it. Less than 1 million people, 577 parishes, I remember, about 640 churches, 112 church schools. I remember the statistics now. About 200 paid clergy, about 100 who were unpaid, and then about 300 or 400 who were retired, because it was a place where people could afford to move in retirement. And I joined the House of Lords in 2004. I was patron or president of about 30 organisations. And I didn't see myself just as running the diocese, but playing a part in wider community life. And we can talk about all that. And I retired 5 years ago, and I seem to keep pretty well occupied, what with being asked by the government to chair an inquiry into all the issues surrounding a breast surgeon who is now imprisoned. And now I'm on the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority as the chair of the licence committee. So I license fertility clinics in retirement. Now that may be an unusual path for a bishop. And what I think I want to say is that this is an unplanned career, which I've described. And if I'd thought, well, I want to be the Bishop of Norwich, I wouldn't have gone to my first 2 parishes, really, because they were as well as being tough places, they're unnoticed places, and that was before there was much interest in the inner city, in the church, and certainly there's never been much interest in the outer estates by anyone very much. I mean, some of these council estates have been very left behind, but I'm glad I went there because they were challenging experiences, and I know I've drawn on what I learned in my 20s and early 30s enormously in my later work. Anyway, that's probably too much.
No, it's not at all. And it's fascinating in terms of the diversity of what you've done, because, as you say, that must have given you some tremendous insights. I mean, those, particularly, I think in the church, I suspect also in places like the police. Then actually, there's huge value in going and working in bits of society that often don't get seen.
Yeah.
I remember when I was working for the government during COVID, I was part of the COVID task force, and one of the things I did there was I set up a team that was going and providing qualitative insight to all of the add on to all of the data that was coming in from places, and so we sent people to largely high prevalence of the disease, where obviously it was the places you probably didn't want to go in the middle of a pandemic. But they were the areas that were the most challenged. And of course, most of those were the poorer areas, a lot of them in the north and the northwest. Mm. And it was really interesting, I think, actually, for my own team, and I did a few of those visits as well, just to get insights into places where you don't normally go. I mean, depending on, if you've had, as certainly I have, a relatively fortunate life in the places I've lived and places I've gone for a lot of the time. And it does give you tremendous different perspective, which I think is really useful. I was hugely amused at the size of the of the diocese in Norfolk. I vividly remember working for one of the squadron commanders that I worked for at Coltishall, just north of Norwich, who said, it's time to leave when you start thinking the A11's a good road. And so, certainly in those days, when in your early days of being in the Bishop of Norwich role, that would definitely have been the case. I mean, transport around Norfolk was not the easiest option, that's for sure. It's got a bit better. But
no, I made a terrible mistake once. It was partly my fault because my PA advised against it. I had successive engagements, one in Heacham, northwest Norfolk, and the next was in Kessingland, which is in Suffolk, south of Lowestoft. And we underestimated the 2 3/4 hours it took to get from one to the other.
Yeah, and the 45 tractors you had to negotiate on the way. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, in other parts of the country, you could have driven about 180 miles in that time, really. Anyway.
Agricultural counties definitely have their wonderful opportunities, but also their challenges, that is for sure. As you mentioned, we'll come back to motivation, and I would like to go there next, really, in terms of when you go right back to the beginning and your motivations, particularly for going into the church. What was it that set you on that path, and kind of how did you prepare for it?
Yeah, my memory is that my future career when I went to university, I didn't really know what it was. I thought of teaching, but that, in a sense, was only because my brother had become a teacher, and it seemed like school is your only experience, and I quite enjoyed school. I wondered a bit about academic life, and then I entertained, believe it or not, a thought or two about accountancy, which, given my lack of numeracy skills, would perhaps not have been a brilliant idea. But at Lancaster, which was a radical university, I did encounter a handful of other students who were exploring ordination, and I was drawn to them because they seemed to have a life that was full of interest. They played football, had a good time. They went to the chapel. They worked hard at their studies, but they had plenty of leisure time. And what struck me was that I was also seeing, in my family and wider contacts, all sorts of people, even senior people, who endured their work rather than finding it life-giving, who were always waiting for the weekend or counting down the days to holidays or retirement. And one of the things that attracted me when I look back on it to the ordained life, it was the intermingling of life and faith and work. And I'm not the sort of person who likes compartmentalizing things. It can be exhausting to do all that. Of course, I could simply say I was called by God, and that's true, but vocation comes through ordinary experience. And what I'm trying to describe is why the ordained life appealed to me. It wouldn't appeal to a lot of people because the home from which you work is also your office. People can come and interrupt. That's one of the things I remember from parish life. Julie, my wife, had to get used to that. There were always people at the door, and they always managed to knock on the door when you were trying to have a meal, and they wanted to be seen, all that sort of stuff. So there is no easy separation. I certainly didn't want a 9 to 5 type of job. And this seemed to give expression to what happened at university, which was, I did have a faith when I went, but I can remember on my first Sunday at university thinking, am I going to get up to go to the chapel or go to church, or am I not going to bother? And the fact that I decided to do that, I suppose, was quite a turning point in my future life, because if I hadn't bothered and I was sharing a room on the campus with another bloke, if I hadn't bothered, I don't think any of this would have happened. It's because I met people there who influenced me, and I might easily not have done that. And you look back and you think, gosh, that was a turning point in life, because I wouldn't then have met my wife, and all sorts of things could have happened. And you think, oh, I wonder what life I would have had if I turned over in bed that morning.
Yeah, it is funny like that, isn't it? When you look at the turning points. I mean, I do exactly that myself. Where I think there are a number of kind of clear points where life, if I'd made different choices on different days, then things could have turned out very differently.
Yeah.
And I mean, none of those I regret, interestingly. I mean, I very much, I tend to say this to people when I'm doing training and things with them as well. Don't be one of these people that if you take a fork in the road, that you get a mile down the next road and then wish you'd actually taken the other fork.
Yeah.
You need to make those decisions and live by the decisions you've made, and not spend too much time looking backwards in life. But it is certainly, you're right. I completely agree. I think there's lots of those kind of turning points that shape what you do.
Which you don't even realise is a turning point. That's the thing, in a way. The thing I look back on is the fact that there are decisions you make. Shall I say yes to that job or no to that job, which is a big decision. But I think some of the biggest turning points of my life have been unknown at the time. Put it that way. That's
yeah. No, it's really interesting reflection.
So there's serendipity in all of this. I suppose that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, fantastic.
Or guidance, or whatever. Who knows what to call it.
So, which is another great segue, because when you look back from where you are now, having had the life you've had, what advice would you be providing to a kind of school-age Graham if you were able to provide some?
Well, it depends whether it's the school-age Graham now or the school-age Graham then. There was a friend of mine whose funeral I took not all that long ago, who had a who's who entry, and his was unique because among his hobbies and interests, he put refraining from giving advice. That was one of it.
Nice.
Actually, he was a wise old bird, and people did go to him for advice, but he would never proffer it. And I think I was quite unsure of myself when I was 17 or 18. I mean, like many people of that age. So I think I'd say to my younger self, trust yourself, and don't refuse to try things because you think you may fail. Because I was scared of failure, and wanted to please. I mean, that's probably part of many of our characters. I think I'd also say be sure you have a really good reason for saying no to any new opportunity before you decline it. Don't say no because you think you may not be up to it. Because just recently, I've given you the illustrations of the Patterson Inquiry and HFEA. I felt I was going beyond my skill set, but even in later life, I find it exciting to do that. So I think I was very hesitant to plunge into new things. when I was younger. So yeah, I think it would be trust yourself and don't refuse to try things because you may fail. That would be my advice. And I suspect that would be the sort of advice I'd give to any 17 or 18-year-old now, although it just feels a very different world in which they're growing up. And I just don't know how to advise some of the younger people of today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just about to come on to that because you made that very interesting comment about, school age then versus school age now, because I think you're right. I mean, for youngsters now, I think the world is incredibly different. I look at, often reflect on this, not least with some of the work I do with younger people who are relatively new in the workplace, that some of the challenges they face, particularly with things like social media and the like, I am so glad that I didn't have any of those, because I think it would be incredibly difficult, and that must be a difficult reflection. And I'm sure in your, obviously, as a lifelong member of the priesthood, I think you must be very used to dealing with people who are finding some of those challenges extremely difficult to navigate.
I agree with that, because I think if I lacked confidence at 17 or 18, self-image is one of the bigger problems among the young now because of social media and all the pressures that they're under. But I think career-wise, it's also difficult in that, it's struggling to get that first job. I mean, even if you're a graduate or one that's commensurate with your abilities and so on. And when I look back, we were such a lucky, I think, unfortunate generation. I can remember all the big companies coming to Lancaster University, setting up their stalls in the Great Hall to attract these, precious undergraduates who were about to graduate into their companies. And I remember, even though I decided I'd go off to read theology and train for ordination, being fascinated by this. Well, it would be unthinkable to do that now. It's entirely the other way round, isn't it? Very, that sort of thing hardly happens in the same sort of way.
Yeah, I think, interestingly, when I look at Deloitte, when I was working there, they still very much did do that. They had a process for attracting in new graduates. I think the competition is really, really toughened up, though, in terms of the quantity of graduates and the sort of relative scarcity of roles that are there. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is this kind of newer generation, Gen Z, if you like, Gen A, I think we've now moved to as well. They are more challenging to people in the workplace already because of their values, and they're very, which is, I think, a really good thing. I think it's opening up all sorts of interesting challenges to managers and leaders in working environments where they're having to really think about, how do I turn around and both get them into the role and also retain them, because there is a sort of drive where lots of them want to dip in and out of different jobs and not stay in places very long. They're very much focused on, if your values don't match my values, then I'm probably not going to come and work for you, which I don't think any of us would have done, back in the day. So it is definitely setting some different tests for employers as well as obviously being tests for the young people themselves.
Yeah. I mean, that you're entirely right. I mean, that I don't think that would have occurred to us, but nor did it occur to many people. I think of my contemporaries at university, people who went and worked in the car industry and so on. I mean, lots of them have stayed with the company that they went to work for 20 years or so. They may have, all of that. There was a sort of sense that you would have a consistent career with a single company that was still around really at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, whereas the portfolio career is also a very different thing. And in some ways, I feel grateful I've had a portfolio career, except that it's all, but there is an integration in it because you're doing it in relation to a call, but it's not a single job. So I've done some very different jobs, but yet with, so I think in some ways I've had a portfolio career, but I'd never actually felt that was happening.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. It was the same in the military. Obviously, I moved jobs every 2.5, 3 years, but within the same organization. And I certainly didn't envisage I was going to stay in the Air Force for 34.5 years when I joined it. So, and again, I think that is fundamentally a difference now where, lots of people joining the workplace. I mean, not only are they not thinking they're going to stay that long, they're actually not staying that long. They're actively looking to move much, much more quickly than that. But Yeah, we could have a much more lengthy discussion, I'm sure, on the topic of today's world. As you know, this podcast is very much about leadership, and you clearly went up through the leadership rungs of the ladder in the church to a pretty high level. And I'm just curious as to how you shifted, adapted, changed your own kind of leadership style as you moved up.
Now, I don't think I ever deliberately changed my leadership style. It was largely instinctive, but looking back, I can see what I was attempting, and there were things that I perhaps wouldn't have described as leadership style that actually was a deliberate attempt to model a certain form of leadership, even though I might not have used those words at the time. It was usually to establish confidence and connection with those with whom I was working, so that there would be a level of trust upon which to build, and especially in the church where, the bishop is remote from most of the clergy he's supposedly supervising. He doesn't see them on a day-to-day basis. And yet I remember one thing I was told when I became Bishop of Norwich by a wise old bird. He said, the one thing a diocesan bishop cannot delegate, you can delegate so many of your functions, you cannot delegate, is the ethos of the diocese. It was an interesting insight, because I think it's true of all organizations where there is one person at the apex. Your style, your character, your approach all contributes the ethos of the organization. It shapes it. Even if you don't deliberately do, you're not deliberately doing it, but it actually alters it. And so all those years ago, I was pondering this, arriving in Norwich. I wondered how to do the job. We've talked about the size of the diocese. There were hundreds of communities, hundreds of clergy and churches, let alone schools and institutions. Even the cathedral employed 80 people and had 500 volunteers. You couldn't possibly know everyone. And yet they would soon know you if you put yourself about a bit. That was the thing that really struck me. And one of the important things, I think, in the first couple of years was to become really known. The diocese was divided into 21 local units that we called deaneries. And in my first year, I went to spend 2 or 3 days in each of them, depending on their size. And it was quite a time commitment. So I'd lead services, I'd visit schools, I'd meet with all the clergy, all the church wardens. I'd go beyond the church as well. I asked, I wanted to see local businesses and meet key people. And I remember, among all that, visiting Lotus Cars and the Bird's Eye factory at Lowestoft. I'm sure I came to RAF Coltishall for the first time in the midst of all of this. I remember going to Kettle Chips and talking with Richard Ellis, then the chief executive, about that remarkable development. I could never believe you could make so much money out of crisps, really, but they made them fashionable. And learning that, 80% of Kettle Chips at the time were consumed alongside a glass of wine. And then I realized that I was also doing that with Kettle Chips. So it's fascinating.
Still going strong too.
Still going strong. Let alone visiting the police in various locations, going out with them. I remember going out with the response vehicle one day in Norwich and sitting in the back of the car, and we went off to one of the local estates where somebody hadn't turned up in court, and the police stopped the car, and one went to the front door of this house and the other was going to go around the back. Well, the person who hadn't turned up in court legged it over the various back gardens and outwitted them and left anyway. And by the time they came back to the car, half of the young people on the estate who should have been at school had gathered around the car. I hadn't realized that a police car would be like a honeypot, And they all said to the police, "Here, they got a vicar in the back. What's he been nicked for?" I thought my sort of street cred rose there, really. But quite a lot of this was enjoyable in itself, although sometimes you presented with intractable problems, within the church that you're meant to suddenly solve. But it did mean that you became known, and just in relation to going up in the Jaguar with you and doing the BBC interview on the way back. One of the great advantages as you know, at the time in Norfolk was that the Eastern Daily Press outsold every national daily. Radio Norfolk, BBC was listened to by more, had a bigger reach than any other local radio station, apart actually from BBC Radio Cornwall down here. It's to do with the distinctiveness of place, isn't it? And at your ordination as a bishop, you're told, or you're commanded, it's in the ordination service, you must know your people and be known by them. And I never forgot those words. That's actually at the base, I think, of what my sense of leadership was. And I also supported a lot of charitable activities. And in those early years, I was much involved in rural issues and became a non-executive director of the Countryside Agency, which was then the big government body implementing the Rural White Paper and so on. It feels a long time ago now. And having established that I was committed to Norfolk, I then took a lead in establishing the Norfolk Community Foundation. I mean, Norfolk had many charities, but it needed a big charity that would help the small ones who were competing for the same sorts of funding. And I thought wasting quite a lot of time in doing so. And all of this was looked upon with a bit of suspicion by some of the established charities at first. But I went to various business people to get a good range of initial trustees. I asked people who had wealth and imagination to support me. And I've been there long enough, I think, in 4 years to be trusted. And so I can remember going to see Bernard Matthews and trying to explain this concept to him. And he said, well, I don't think I understand what you're talking about, Bishop, but you're a good man, and here's 50,000. So that's that sort of thing helped. And somebody
chalk that up as a win then, I think. Yeah.
And somebody else paid without ever it being known for our grants manager to begin with. And now the Community Foundation has an endowment of over 25 million and gives away 6 million each year. It's been a huge success. But I sensed that it would work in Norfolk because people love the county and were committed to it. But you could only take, how can I put this? I'm not being very clear about the leadership models, but you could only do that if you'd established yourself as someone to be trusted, who would do things not for their own sake, but for others, that you were seen not simply to be a church figure, but a wider community figure, So I suppose I did have a leadership style. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done that sort of thing. I mean, I also co-sponsored the very first academy in Norfolk, and I was approached by the county because it wouldn't have got money for new schools if it didn't, under the Blair government, have an academy, and it found it difficult to find one. And so the Open Academy on Heartsease that replaced Heartsease High School was the first and pretty controversial academy because lots of people opposed it. But it's regenerated the estate and its environment, and of course given lots of opportunities for young people in that area. So all this sums up her leadership style. It's intending, I think, to be encouraging, to be trusting, to be committed, but one in which you could take some risks really for the common good. And I suppose that's the thing about it. It's no point in just luxuriating in trust and good relationships for their own sake. You've got to do something with it. And I think once you've established, this is the real advantage of staying in a place for a long time. Once you've established yourself, you can take some risks because people think, oh, well, I'm not sure about that idea, but if he thinks that might work, I might support it. That's I hadn't worked all that out in my mind while I was doing these things, but I realized that was the sort of leadership that I was exercising.
No, there's some fabulous examples in there. That's really great, and great tribute to you as well with things like the growth of the Community Foundation. I mean, that's amazing. For me, that fits perfectly. I mean, I think that makes absolute sense in your kind of position to do that. And I agree with you about the longevity of position totally as well. I think, if you've in that kind of role, spending that amount of time to really get to know people well, to be a much more trusted figure within the community, is something, obviously, I mean, it's the old cliche, isn't it? Respect's really hard won and easily lost, and taking the time to build it up in the first place and then maintaining and enhancing that is obviously key.
But it is one of the things that's changed in some of the other roles. I mean, I would go out of my way to try and befriend some of the people who had lonely roles. So I'd invite them to breakfast, whether it was the chief fire officer or the new chief constable or the vice chancellor of either of the universities and so on. And I wasn't there that long before I realized I was on my fifth vice chancellor, my fifth chief constable, and these roles, which were much longer term at one stage, have become shorter term. And I'm not sure that's to the benefit of the cohesion of society, to have such rapid changes in leadership, which, of course, is reflected in our political life, really.
I agree with you. And I think the other aspect of that, and it's often talked about in the military world as well, in terms of length of roles, where most of the time we were spending 2.5, 3 years, probably maximum, particularly in some of the senior command roles. Then accountability is the other thing. Actually having, you take decisions that often don't come into effect really, and the impact of them is not seen for a number of years after you've made the decision. And if you're no longer there, then it's obviously very difficult to turn around, and it's easy for your successor to say, well, that was the predecessor's time, which is not great, and you're not held to account either, which I think is a little bit unfortunate for some areas where probably people should be.
Well, that was one of the things I said towards the end, during my last 5 years or so, that anything that's wrong in the Diocese of Norwich is my fault, because it's nearly everybody has been new in that time in their appointments. And it was quite funny. Organisations, people like to depersonalise them, don't they? So I'd often have somebody who complain that the diocese had done this or the diocese. I said, "Oh, you mean me?" He said, "No, not you, Bishop. You're fine. It's the diocese that's done this." So, and it's much easier to blame the faceless bureaucracy than the person in front of you.
Oh, totally so. Yeah. And I think actually within an organisation, it's interesting. One of the things I talk to people a lot about when I'm doing leadership training with them, and they're growing up into leadership roles, more senior leadership roles in an organisation, is I regret to tell you, you are now part of the leadership. So blaming the leadership is no longer something that you can use as an option. Because you may still have people above you, but you absolutely have a clear role within the leadership hierarchy that you need to be exercising. And I think it's important people do recognise that. Just before we move on, I mean, one of the things that struck me as you were talking, and my recollection of you at the time I saw you in the role in Norwich, is that you steered clear of the kind of political arena for the most part. And I'm just wondering how that helped you, or whether you felt it did help you, and whether or not it is something that is a risk area, because I know that it's a controversial topic in terms of church politics and all the rest of it, as to how much involvement, and I completely get the logic that the senior church leaders wish to speak for, the people and represent a view, particularly in some of the cases where there's a bit of a political vacuum rather too often. But how do you see that? Was it helpful to stay fairly apolitical?
It's interesting that was your impression, because in my first year, if you remember, Barclays shut quite a lot of its rural branches, and so I ended up having meetings. I mean, there was quite a lot of coverage of what I'd said about that, because it was at a time where we had much more of a cash economy, and the removal of those facilities were quite detrimental to small businesses as well as individuals in rural areas. So that created a bit of controversy, I remember, in my early days. What I tended not to do was pronounce on things where I didn't have a story to tell about the church's involvement. So if I spoke about drugs or alcohol abuse, it was out of being patron of the Matthew Project, in Norwich. Or I can remember introducing some legislation for the Broads Authority in the House of Lords. And I was willing to get involved in things where I felt that I had a story and a contribution to tell rather than just words.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that makes absolute sense.
So that was also true with the community foundation. It was meant to help the poorest in our community. That was the intention. And of course, as well as that, I did some stuff on affordable housing, but that was on the basis that we had some church examples using our own land and providing affordable housing in some of the wealthier pockets. So I remember opening a new group of houses in the Burnhams, where you needed some local housing for local people. So I tended to constrict my interventions politically to those things where the church could make a difference, where the church could lead by example, because I think your leadership then is much more listened to if you've got something to say that you are doing, rather than pontificating from a distance about something that you're not engaged in.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. That's very helpful. Sticking with leadership, and I'll come to role models in a minute, because I think that's an area that's always of interest, but sort of traits and values that you look for, not only in things that you think are important yourself and for you personally, but things you look for in others in the leadership space. What would be your reflection?
Apologize quickly when you get something wrong, I think, is one of the first things. I was struck 2 or 3 years into my time in Norwich when we employed 2 diocesan councillors who people could go and see, clergy and their families, with. Well, it saved it. I think it did a huge amount of good, in the sense that you can't always go to the people who've got pastoral care of you, because they're also your employers. So sometimes there may be something going on in your life that you want some counselling or advice. And so we employed 2 counsellors. It was quite an expensive thing to do, and people always complained about it in the early days. But I think it still happens. It's just 1 counsellor now because it's so expensive. But it still happens in that diocese, and it's unusual. But I can remember one of the counsellors saying to me after I'd been there about 3 years, you won't know how much difference it makes. But some of the clergy have said, because I would say to them, if I've made an error or I'd forgotten something, that I was sorry that I'd done it. And they told me that's one of the most, that's your reputation, is that you'll say sorry if you get something wrong. And I thought, well, I've never thought of that as an important leadership function, but I think it is, because instinct always is to be defensive. And I know I can feel like that, but I've always thought apologise when you've got something wrong. Be willing to be persuaded, and be clear when you've changed your mind. I think, I did change my mind on some policies. I mean, don't harbour grudges. Give praise where it's due, and I think the other thing that was important among my suffragan bishops, archdeacons, the people who are closest in the leadership roles, appoint people around you who may be more capable than you are in some areas. Because I think there is a temptation in leaders, especially those in a very hierarchical organization, to appoint people who won't outshine them, but actually really able people, well, not only do they move on to other jobs, and that actually means that the diocese looks like somewhere that is going places, but I think appointing people who will not overshadow you is a mistake, really.
No, I totally agree. That's a great point. It's and actually one that I think is definitely worth re-emphasizing, because I think too many people either surround themselves with mini-me's or, as you say, put people in who are definitely going to be compliant rather than in any way challenging to them, and not necessarily the best possible people they could get into the role, which I think is a real shame, because I think there's nothing wrong with them. And many times in my military career did I find myself in rooms with people who were had considerably better attributes for some of the things we were doing than me, and it was harnessing their talents was the important thing. And I think as a leader, that was the trick, wasn't it? It was to really make sure you found a way to give them room to breathe and exercise their own, bring their own opinions into the argument, and hopefully then make them count.
Yeah, but it's sometimes challenging to do, especially when somebody has gifts that are so different from your own. But I knew that. I mean, my senior leadership team was really only about 10 people, but I needed a real mix of talents there, and I can remember times when I had one suffragan bishop who was absolutely extroverted, another was quite an introvert and rather academic, and was great at writing lengthy papers that I need, and documents, whereas the other one wouldn't have been able to write a document between now and the end of the year, but he could go and galvanize a group of people because of his personality, his persuasiveness, so you need that range of talents and gifts around you. And I've always been suspicious of these charts about, what skills do we lack and so on. But I realized that I was appointing people on the basis of, well, what sort of personality and skill set, are we missing here? What would complement, what would strengthen that group? What would bring something different to it that everybody else would be grateful for? Even if, as you say, it could be challenging. I can think of one person who was appointed who in the first staff meeting hardly stopped talking, and I had to have a word with him about it because, he was giving his opinions on everything, whereas somebody else who had lots to say was, you had to coax it out of them. So it's managing them to work as a team, of course, is the other challenge. And I don't think I ever had any training in that. But anyway, over 20 years, we do always have very different characters, but quite a happy staff team.
Yeah, and the whole personality profiling thing is interesting in this space, I think, where one of the uses of it actually is to understand yourself a little bit, but also most importantly to understand what other types of people are out there and how you can get the best out of them. Because if they're very different to you, then you need to find ways of doing that. And as you say, bring it together as a coherent team, because if you're not doing that, it's a real challenge. There's some great points in there. Thanks ever so much. That's really helpful. What about role models then? Who's impressed you the most over the years?
I wrote a book a few years ago about, it was a book intended for Lent, but it's a rather wider book about 40 people, all of whom were dead, some of whom I'd never met, who'd been inspiring to me. I wouldn't call them role models. What I've looked for are inspiring people who have had a lasting impact on me. I wouldn't necessarily, want to imitate them all. But among all of them, in terms of the question is apposite, because among all the people I've worked for, I think it was Robert Runcie who I held in greatest affection and admiration when he was Archbishop of Canterbury. He was an achiever. He was an archbishop with a military cross, not too many of those, although he never, he got it for when he was a tank commander and saving, he never talked about it, which of course was why he was a rather persuasive sort of character. Those who've been through the action seem to speak about it least. But he was entirely without arrogance and seemed surprised by his own success, which is why I was so fond of him. He had an acutely questioning mind, so he could never be captured by the latest intellectual fad or religious or political movement. But the thing I noticed was he always gave himself fully to the people he was with, or whatever event he attended. And he took as much trouble over the smallest of engagements as he did over the royal wedding, between the present king and Princess Diana. And I last spoke to him a few days before his death in 2000, in my first year in Norwich. And he was then himself dying from prostate cancer. And he wanted to get the words right at an address that he was due to give for a mutual friend. This address was in St Albans Abbey. He had to give it from his wheelchair. And he tried out his words over the telephone with me. And I thought, gosh, even while he himself is, because he knew he was dying, he wants to just get this right for our friend. And when he came home from giving that last address, he went to bed and drifted into unconsciousness and died himself a few days later. And I was privileged to preach at his funeral in St Albans Abbey. And so I think I've always tried to give my full attention to and preparation for any engagement because people are worth it. And one of the things that I sensed from Robert was that, of course, you're surrounded by important people if you're the Archbishop of Canterbury, but whoever it was, he thought people were worth his undivided attention, and it's a sign of your care for them and, of course, of God's love for them. But if there is a role model, it's him, really.
Yeah, that's fabulous. What a great example. As you say, that's really powerful, and yeah, great story. That's very moving. I do try and cover kind of highs and lows of people's careers in these, and everyone's got a roller coaster ride, I think, in across the time. But looking back across your career as a whole, is there anything you wish you'd done differently, and if so, why?
I'm sure I ought to be able to come up with things where I should have taken a completely different direction in policy or leadership. I mean, what I'm drawn to realize is that my worst decisions were making the wrong appointments of people, and especially where I had an instinct that I was making the wrong appointment at the time, but got persuaded by others around me that it was the right one.
It almost goes back to your trust yourself comment from earlier, doesn't it?
And I can think of one in particular. I mean, I won't name them, but the scores, these score sheets and interviews and so on were all high, and, there was a plausibility, but I knew enough to think, I'm not sure, you don't always see the real person. That's why I don't trust interviews entirely as a means of selection. And making this wrong appointment, which I had it, I should have trusted my gut. It led to years of trouble for a town with the wrong vicar. This vicar would have been wrong anywhere. But I look back and so many people became distressed, unhappy, ill, and it was a very difficult situation to resolve. And it's not the only one. I mean, I can think of the one I'm thinking of is the worst one because I thought it left so many people damaged, unnecessarily. And one of the difficulties that the church has is removing people who are difficult or incompetent, but have actually done nothing illegal or immoral. There are other ways of being absolutely awful than being illegal or immoral. We've got ways to manage those, but we're not very good. We got capability procedures, but they didn't work. Anyway, it's that I look back on, and you can't get every appointment right, but at the same time, when you get a major appointment wrong, it can lead to real tragedy, I think. And I can think of people who've had their lives changed as a result of that bad appointment. And it goes back to my, as you say, trust your gut instincts when you've had some experience. The longer
No, so very interesting, very interesting. I mean, I can easily see from both pre and post-military life examples where I've been involved in appointment panels where you get close to exactly those kind of decisions. And as you say, the interview process is far from perfect. It's getting a kind of judgment. What would this individual actually be like in the role? Were they given it, kind of thing? So no, that's a powerful point. Thanks. What about the high point then? What's the what do you think is considers your most significant achievement?
Well, probably. I mean, looking back, it probably is the creation of the Norfolk Community Foundation because it will be perhaps the most lasting achievement. I mean, I suppose there's so many church academies in Norfolk now. I mean but they've altered, of course. I think the other thing, in my 20 years in Norwich, we didn't close any of our over 600 churches, and I was not a church closer. Some people thought I should have been. but there were few, if any, alternative uses for these churches that were in out-of-the-way rural places. And closing a church in a rural community frequently takes the heart out of a place, even if people don't often go to it. It's if it's a visibly dead, inert structure, or indeed sometimes if it's pulled down, the landscape, is altered. And I did think one of the things I had to do was to maintain the soul of Norfolk, which, of course, its landscape is littered with church buildings, which were they're probably in better condition now than they've ever been. It's just that we expect everything to be in perfect nick now, which, 100 years ago, you could have grass growing up the aisle and nobody would care, but now you're not allowed to. So they are probably in better nick than they ever were. And one of the extraordinary things, given the population, the fact that most of the churches were medieval and cost a vast amount to maintain, was that the parishes in Norfolk would contribute £7 million a year to the costs of the diocese through on top of their running costs. Now, that's quite an appeal each year, £7 million.
Yeah, it's huge.
And that happened year after year after year, and we did when the diocese was in a reasonably healthy financial state, I think, by the time I'd left it. So it was when I arrived, but it could have gone the other way. And so it was thanking people for their generosity and taking some leadership in financial things. So all those are significant, I think.
Yeah, I think that you do, again, great examples. That Community Foundation one, I think, is particularly strong, and you should be very proud of that. That's for sure. It was interesting on the church buildings thing, because, even if you're not very religious, I think the church and the pub probably in a village are the heart of the village in many instances. And of course, the pubs have been very different to churches. They're really in trouble.
The pubs, that's one of the most noticeable things about Norfolk in my time, is the closure of so many village pubs.
Yeah, it's a real shame.
So the church was in many of the small villages. We had 150 of our parishes had a total population of less than 150. You could, and usually with a rather big church building, you could fit in the total population several times over into quite a number of the churches. But for many of them, it was interesting, and to try and recruit clergy who were committed to those sorts of places. I can remember I used to take pilgrimages to the Holy Land. I used to take all the curates for a week during their time to Israel and the Palestinian territories, and we would stay in Bethlehem, the wrong side of the separation wall. And I can remember saying to the chaplain to the Archbishop of Jerusalem, who'd worked in Lambeth before, I've got a mission task, and that is to find clergy to work in rural Norfolk. Anyway, for once, this chap listened to me, and one of my last acts was to put him into the Matlas group of parishes, which he's got a number of small village parishes, in not one of which is there a shop or a pub. The churches are the only community facilities at all. And he's done a fantastic job there, welding them together and giving them life. And I think that's still possible in some of these small places. We mustn't think that the whole world has turned its back on the possibility of church community life, where the boundaries are blurred. It's still important.
No, I agree. And I think, interestingly, when you look at the future of work kind of scenarios that I've been discussing with other people in different contexts, where there are clearly, the sands are shifting somewhat in where people work, how they work, what's coming in terms of changes with artificial intelligence, all those sorts of things. And yet there is at least a prospect within that actually more people working more from home and back in their communities and sort of driving energy back into the communities is a possibility, I think. So, and that can only be a good thing if that actually does happen. You obviously touched on the appointments issue, but career low point, personal career low point for you, is that one and the same thing, or is there something else?
Well, no, I think when I look back, it didn't last very long, but it was towards the end of my second job in that parish in Welwyn Garden City. I suppose I had a reputation with the bishops of the diocese that I was good on council estates, and they were grateful for that. And so I remember then being asked to go to Luton to an even newer church on an even newer council estate. This would be about when would this have been? About 1982. And the previous vicar had left his wife and gone off with another woman in the congregation. So you can imagine, it wasn't a very happy sort of situation. And I remember going with Julie and saying, I really want something different. I don't want, this feels like the same thing again, that I've done twice. It wasn't that I did, it wasn't that it wasn't a good job. I don't know. I could have done it, but I needed a different stimulation. I needed a different challenge. I needed a more intellectual challenge rather than a pastoral one, I think. And I felt low, thinking that no one had the imagination to see that my gifts could be used differently in a different setting. And I never forgot that as a bishop, and always trying to help clergy move to a different challenge. There's no point in just them moving from one parish to another one that's just like it. In other words, be sensible if you're working in the middle of Norwich, to go out into the countryside or go to Great Yarmouth or something, and all the seaside town problems or whatever, or perhaps become a chaplain to a school or become a military chaplain or something like that, do something different. And actually it was, it was around that time I was also persuaded by a friend of mine to go for a parish post that I didn't really want. And I was interviewed for that and my heart wasn't in it. And I was not selected. And I felt, oh gosh, I'm coming to the end. And oddly enough, it was just at that low point that I opened the Church Times and I saw that selection job at Church House. And as I say, it wasn't a time when you tended to apply for jobs. You waited to be asked. And that was in some ways the moment when my career path changed. And I knew I wanted to do that because of my experience with ordination candidates in the parish and because I wanted, if you like, to change the system, so anyway, the poacher turned gamekeeper in the end, but that was a difficult time when I thought, gosh, I could spend the next 40 years doing exactly the same sort of job, and I need the stimulation of something different.
Yeah, it is. That's fascinating when you look at the low point turning into opening the door to an opportunity that then shaped the rest of your career, really. And that's terrific. That's really powerful.
And having the courage, of course, to say no at that time. I was young and saying no to the bishop, I did say.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is not an easy thing to do.
No, it isn't. No. So anyway.
On to more cheery things, recognising that you spend probably a bit less time, at least, working than you used to.
Yeah.
When you were really looking back to when you were busier and in the sort of full-time world, what did you do to maintain, if you like, the work-life balance, de-stress and relax in a world where clearly, as you said earlier, people often knocked on the door. I guess generally they were knocking on the door for reasons that were not that cheery. Then how did you find ways to take that away?
Well, we've always taken decent holidays. There's no doubt about that. They times of refreshment, but I've been hopeless at days off. Trying to cut the day out in the diary to go and do something else. So what I always did was to try to mix working days with pleasure as well. Well, I can think of many occasions when I might be speaking at an event or a reception at 7:00 and finishing that and then managing to be in my seat in the Theatre Royal at 7:30 with Julie, for whatever would be happening. And so we mixed pleasure in the working day, and I suppose I benefit from getting my energy from other people as well, rather than needing lots of social isolation. So lots of things were enjoyable that other bishops may have to endure. I did on the whole enjoy the drinks receptions for this, that, and the other. I enjoyed the Norfolk and Norwich festival events. Going to see Norwich City as a guest of one of the directors. You went dressed like this, so you were on display, as it were, as the Bishop of Norwich. You weren't not the bishop, but it was enjoyment and relaxation and fun as well. So I was quite good, I think, at turning what could be public engagements into fun. Now, I think they said of the Queen Mother, she turned everything she did into a party, and so there was. There's a bit of that in it. So I don't know. I felt it was quite a balanced life. What it didn't have, I mean, apart from when I went on retreat and just had a few days away, it didn't have periods of, some people need periods on their own. Introverted personalities, just need to get away from other people. And I think one of the things that's important for me is to mix the social and the work life. I mean, I would always have residential meetings of my senior staff team, of the Bishop's Council, which is the elected, if you like, standing committee of the diocese. I'd take them away for a weekend. The rural deans, who are the people in charge of these deanery units, the area deans, I took them away for 24 or 48 hours as well. And if I took my staff team away, we'd always go to London, because you could get other people to come and speak, from whether it's from Parliament or church commissioners or church house and so on, depending on what the issues were. But in the evening, we'd always have a theatre visit, a meal in a decent restaurant. We'd go to the House of Lords or whatever, or somewhere, so that we actually had a lot of social time together, and that bonded the team, but it also reflected the way in which I operated, I think. So I've always thought an organisation that eats and drinks together makes better policy together. So that's...
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that the social aspect of that is key. And I think it's actually, going back to my future work thing, I think it's one of the challenges a lot of companies are facing at the moment is that, they don't have that cohesion and you've got a number of, particularly back to the youngsters thing, a number of people who've entered the workplace in a world where that has all changed because they came into work during COVID. And I've found that kind of transition quite challenging. So because definitely I agree, if you want a team to really be at its most efficient, then some level of social interaction associated with that, I think, is a really, really useful thing to do. Couldn't agree more.
And that must be the challenge of all the working from home. I mean, the odd thing is I have worked from home, but it's been working from home in a rather different way.
Yeah, you were attached to the church, so there's a walk straight through the door into it. Yeah. Talking of the church, you must reflect. I mean, you spent your whole life, really, working life in church roles. I mean, the 2021 census in England and Wales was, I guess, pretty bad news from the church point of view, in that that was suggesting that religion or religiousness, if you like, as a nation was plummeting. Less than 50% of the population of England and Wales consider themselves Christian. Just wondering how you think the church, not necessarily you personally, but how you think the church deals with that and what it's able to do to try and shift that.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I mean, when I was ordained in 1975, it seems a very long time ago now, people would say they were C of E, even though they never ever went to church and probably had no faith really, but they wanted to be thought respectable and not immoral. To be Christian was to be moral in a way. And now it's entirely the other way round, especially among young people. The church, because of its views on, or its perceived views on same-sex relationships or the abuse scandals, is thought not to be the acme of morality. So I think now people are much less reluctant to tick the Christian box. And of course, even the way the census question is set affects the result, because no religion is now put as the first option. And if it was the last, the result might be a bit different. So I don't get too hung up on the statistics, but I think they do reflect a social change. I mean, the odd thing is that the UK is both a more multi-faith society than it's ever been, and also a more secular one. And the two things seem to be true at the same time. London is a much more religious city than the average Norfolk market town would be religious. That's another change. If you go back to the 1950s, the strength of the church was in the market towns and in the suburbs, and the city was a wasteland of faith. That's completely changed, and it's changed within the church as well. And I suppose the secular worldview is that, the world will be better off without religion. But it strikes me most humanists and secularists believe in the dignity of the human person. They value kindness more than cruelty, but rarely realize that the secular ethics they hold derive really from Christianity's revolutionary impact on the Greek and Roman worlds. You have to remember that, the Greek and Roman worlds were thought to be rather wonderful because they were built on learning and philosophy, beauty and the arts. And some people, an elite, enjoyed these things, but their enjoyment required a huge number of slaves, and no one in the ancient world thought that was bad. And the Christian ethic, of course, came in, the Judeo-Christian ethic, because, of course, it comes out of Judaism, which saw the image of God in every human person, which always meant slavery was problematic, even if it was accommodated for a long time. So I'm not sure the disappearance of Christianity in the West will herald a more loving and tolerant society. And my sense is that we are not becoming more loving and more tolerant in all sorts of ways, sadly. And I do wonder what the future of Western European civilization is if Christianity continues to decline as it is. I always hope for a renewal of Christianity. I don't think the church will renew itself by worrying about its own life, if you follow what I mean. The church is only attractive if it's a place of faith and hope and not worry about its continuing existence. You don't join an organization, or you don't join a group that's worried about its own continuing existence. So I don't worry about the future of the church. I do worry about the future of our civilization. I do wonder whether we're a bit like the Roman Empire in the year 400, or thereabouts. The Vandals are at the gates. I mean, they're not quite at the gates as they were physically then. The empire seemed relatively secure, but it was in decline, and it took about another 150 years or more to disintegrate visibly. I've no idea what will happen to Western civilization, but unless there is some form of spiritual renewal, I don't really have a huge amount of hope for it. So that's my gloomiest assessment.
Yeah, no, it is a gloomy, but I think I share your concerns at a number of levels. I think, if you just look at state-on-state warfare, I think when the Cold War ended, we all thought that was kind of, okay, that's done. And now, thanks to, not least to Mr. Putin, then, of course, we've changed the perspective on that. And what's going on in other places, not least Israel, Gaza, and you mentioned going out there. It's just horrendous at the moment. So and when you look at the political landscape in not least Western Europe, but also in America, where I've never seen America so divided. I've talked to on this podcast. I've talked to a number of Americans already, and I've got a few more in the ideally coming up. That. It's a really challenging world we're living in, for sure. So no, I do agree with that. But it was only with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, that I remember reading Francis Fukuyama's, The End of History. Liberal democracy had triumphed, and it now looks almost beaten. That's the tragedy of our world. I will worry more about that than I do about church attendance, because I think, our holding ethics are fragile at the moment. Yeah, no. Let's not be too despondent. Let's be, hopefully optimistic that they can turn around the other way again. But I think you're right. It's definitely challenging. I think there's some difficult areas.
And I always believe that there's there's the possibility of renewal, and it usually comes through charismatic individuals, whether it's a sort of St. Francis of Assisi or I don't know. It needs it needs another Desmond Tutu or Nelson Mandela, but, because I've got a brother-in-law in South Africa, and at one stage I thought, well, there's bound to be a bloodbath, but it is extraordinary that, there was a grace in what happened at the time of the end of apartheid that you don't see now.
I think Mandela was an extraordinary character, absolutely extraordinary character. I mean, if in the cliche question about who would be a dinner party guest, I would definitely have him. I mean, quite amazing what he managed to achieve, and his own kind of lack of malice and resentment for the way he'd been treated was just extraordinary. Two brief questions, Graham, before we sort of finish the interview bit of this. And I always ask these: what's the most memorable event of your career?
Well, I suppose personally, it's probably being at the birth of my children, but that's not what you're asking. I mean, career-wise, in some ways, it ought to be when I was consecrated as a Bishop in Westminster Abbey, or on my enthronement in Norwich Cathedral, or even my farewell services, because 2,000 or 3,000 people came to them, and that was incredibly moving and humbling, really. But oddly enough, you can't easily remember these big events. You go through them, and other people remember them better than you. And I suppose the greatest privilege, you get used to it, but being the Bishop of Norwich was going to spend a couple of nights after Christmas at Sandringham every year, and I can remember the first year going, and you preached to the royal family so often, and you got to know them, because it's only the royal family were there when you go. And I can remember the Duke of Edinburgh looking me up and down in my first year and said, "Are you happy, Clappy?" I said, "No, I'm Smells and Bells." Caused him to laugh, which helped really. And so yeah, it's not an event, but the most memorable thing was actually seeing the Queen so often, and I was glad so much was made of her Christian faith when she died, because it made her the person that she was. And I suppose in some ways, memorable event. Oh, I did go and have lunch with her, just her and her private secretary at Windsor, not all that long before she died, and we were just on our own together, and that was a massive privilege, really.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Huge.
In some ways, that's the most memorable event. And she didn't think she was very special, but she thought the office that she held was very special. That's, in some ways, it's exactly what I feel about being a bishop. The office is so much more than the person. And for somebody to be the most famous woman in the world and to be so modest was extraordinary, really.
Yeah, it's a fabulous answer and a fabulous memory, that's for sure. The last interview question, I'm going to ask you one other thing, is, and I always ask this, what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
Well, I can remember one. I used to always feel that the most difficult interviewers were children in a primary school. And I remember one girl asked me, "When you pray, what's your picture of God?" And I thought, blimey, that's a profound question.
Yeah, that's really profound, isn't it?
And I thought, what can I say? And actually, I've thought about it so often, because, of course, we're told we see God in the face of Jesus Christ. At the time, I remember saying, well, God is light, and actually I don't have an image of a person, but, I see light, and of course we can only see everything else through light. And I thought, well, that's a terribly complicated answer for a 8-year-old, but it actually shows the sort of insight of children. And you think, what happens to that as we grow older? I've often felt that children think of God very naturally, and it's a pity we become cynical really as we grow.
More cynical and corrupted as we grow older.
So that's just one example, but don't go on stage with children and animals. But I always thought I never knew what I was going to get in the school.
Yeah, I can imagine that. That's for sure. You have been incredibly generous with your time, but as I said at the front end of this, I am very conscious this is going to go out on Easter Sunday, which seems entirely appropriate. I would love it if you could just give a bit of an Easter message for the listeners at the end of this.
Yeah. Well, having been a bit gloomy about Western European civilization, let me be more cheerful, really, because of Easter. Easter's often misunderstood because we all understand Christmas because we understand about the birth of a child, but Easter is, of course, the greatest festival, but we don't usually know somebody who's been resurrected. So I was thinking, here we are on Good Friday recording this. I mean, we see a leader sentenced to a cruel death, probably the cruelest form of execution human beings have devised. Jesus has lost his disciples. They ran away. And the movement is over. They seem to have backed the wrong person. This style of quiet, compassionate leadership doesn't seem to work after all. And then Easter Day, resurrection, except no one sees it. No one sees it. It's always worth remembering that Jesus doesn't display any power or tell Herod or Pontius Pilate they got it wrong. And he allows himself to be discovered, first of all, by a woman. I mean, in an age where women weren't reliable witnesses, and Mary Magdalene thinks he's a gardener, and then he's discovered as a stranger on a country walk. And I think it's a reminder that God doesn't impose himself on us because love doesn't impose itself on us. It must always be discovered. And the message of Easter is all about this. We all suffer dejection, despair, but there is hope and love can be discovered again. And Easter is, I think, the most powerful statement that ever was, that at the heart of this universe, there's a power of love which holds all things together. And that, for me, is God. It's this power of love that I see as the most immense force in the universe, even if we sometimes hardly believe it's there, and it can always be discovered. And I think that probably the greatest forms of leadership are not imposed on people. They're discovered when people say of that person, he's interested in us, he'll give himself to us, he'll not just take from us. And that's the person I believe was resurrected on Easter Day, who epitomizes the power of love at the heart of the universe. So that's why I wish everyone a very happy Easter indeed.
Fabulous message. Thank you very much indeed, Graham. I really appreciate everything you've said. It's been wonderful to talk to you again after so long. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Bob, for the privilege of doing it. I've enjoyed it.
Not at all. It's been a delight. Thank you very much.